9-year-old Jaden Foster had been in the foster system for 3 years, moved through 4 different placements since his mother lost custody, and on the day he stood on the Family Feud stage next to his current foster parents, the Whitakers, he said 3 words to Steve Harvey that dropped the entire studio into a silence so complete that a technician later described it as the quietest 200 people I've ever heard in my life. Jaden wasn't asking for prize money. Not really, though the Whitakers, a retired couple in their early 60s raising him on a fixed pension, could have used it. He was answering a simple, throwaway question Steve asked as a warm-up bit, the kind of question meant to get a cute laugh from the audience. Instead, Jaden looked up at him and said, "Nobody stays long." The morning had started the way every taping morning does. Steve arrived at the Atlanta studio just before 9, running through his usual pre-show energy with the crew, joking with a cameraman about the Falcons game the night before. Backstage, 2 families waited to compete. The Whitakers, with Jaden, and the Delgado family from Orlando, a large, tight-knit group with 3 generations sitting in the green room together. Jaden sat quietly beside his foster mother, Carol Whitaker, in a folding chair, tugging at the sleeve of a jacket that was a size too big for him, a hand-me-down from a previous foster placement. He kept his eyes down most of the time, not out of shyness exactly, but out of the particular watchfulness kids in the system develop early, a way of scanning a room before deciding it's safe to relax in it. Steve did his usual round of family introductions, cracking a joke about the Delgados' matching t-shirts, then crouched down to say hello to Jaden specifically, the way he often does with the youngest contestant on stage. But nobody in that studio knew what was coming. Carol and her husband Dennis had been foster parents for 11 years, taking in over a dozen children in that time, most staying anywhere from a few months to just over a year before reunification, adoption elsewhere, or aging out of a placement that wasn't working. Jaden had come to them 14 months earlier, after his 3rd placement disrupted when the previous foster family said they weren't equipped to handle his behavioral needs, a phrase that masked what was really happening. Jaden had started refusing to unpack his bags in new homes, sensing, correctly, each time, that the stay wouldn't last. His biological mother had lost custody after a series of incidents tied to substance use, and though she'd been in and out of treatment programs since, the courts had not yet restored any visitation beyond supervised monthly calls, which she'd missed 4 times in the past year. Jaden's case file, which Carol had read in full during her required training as his foster placement, documented a pattern the caseworkers themselves flagged with concern. 2 prior placements had specifically cited attachment difficulties as a reason the arrangement wasn't working, language that Carol found both clinically accurate and quietly devastating, since it described a boy protecting himself the only way he knew how. His first placement, immediately after removal from his mother's home, lasted 5 months before the foster family relocated out of state and declined to bring him along. His second placement lasted 7 months before a change in the foster mother's own health made continued care impossible. By the time he reached his 3rd placement, the one that used the phrase "not equipped," Jaden had already learned the pattern well enough to protect himself from the ending before it came. Carol and Dennis lived on Dennis's pension from 30 years as a postal worker and Carol's part-time hours at a church administrative office. Income that stretched thin even before accounting for Jaden's needs, which included weekly therapy sessions their insurance only partially covered. The state reimbursement for foster care covered basic expenses, but nothing close to Therapy Co. pays. Extracurricular activities, or the extra clothing a growing 9-year-old required. Dennis had applied for a supplemental assistance program through the county twice, denied the first time for incomplete paperwork he'd actually submitted correctly, a clerical error on the county's end that took 6 weeks to untangle, Weeks during which Jaden's therapy co-pays went unpaid and nearly resulted in the practice dropping him as a client. Denied the second time because the program had a cap on households already receiving standard foster reimbursement, regardless of documented additional need, a rule Dennis argued made no logical sense, but had no real avenue to appeal. A caseworker suggested a nonprofit grant for foster families with therapeutic needs. Denied because Jaden's case file hadn't been updated with his most recent trauma assessment, a bureaucratic gap nobody had caught, meaning the very documentation that would have justified the grant simply didn't exist in the system yet, through no fault of the Whitakers at all. Dennis, a methodical man by nature after 3 decades of sorting mail by rigid rule and routine, kept a binder with tabs for every application, every denial letter, every phone call, logged with date and time. By the taping, the binder ran to nearly 60 pages, each one a small monument to a system that kept asking the Whitakers to prove, over and over, something they had already proven the first time. What Carol hid from almost everyone, including her own adult children who called to check in, was how much this particular placement had worn on both her and Dennis physically. She was 63 years old, managing a 9-year-old's night terrors 3 or 4 times a week, waking at 2 a.m. to sit with him until he calmed down enough to sleep again, then getting up at 6 to get him to school. She told her sister on the phone she was doing just fine, keeping busy. She told her pastor she felt blessed to help. She told Jaden, on the nights he apologized for waking her up, "You never have to be sorry, baby. I'm not going anywhere." She meant it completely. But she also hadn't had a full night's sleep in over a year, had developed a heart arrhythmia her doctor attributed partly to stress, and quietly worried, more nights than she admitted to Dennis, whether her own health would hold out long enough to see Jaden through to 18. Her cardiologist had recommended she reduce stress where possible, advice she found almost darkly funny given her circumstances, and had adjusted her medication twice in 6 months, trying to keep her heart rhythm stable. Dennis, for his part, had quietly taken on nearly all of the household's physical labor himself, worried that the stress of Jaden's night terrors combined with everything else might be too much for Carol's heart to bear if he didn't shoulder more. He never said this directly to her, not wanting to suggest she couldn't handle her share. But Carol noticed anyway, the way spouses married 39 years tend to notice things left unspoken. And it became one more thing neither of them talked about directly, each protecting the other from a truth they both already understood. Jaden's guardedness wasn't something Carol could fix with reassurance alone, because he'd learned the hard way that adult promises about staying didn't always hold. He'd stopped decorating his side of the shared bedroom he had with the Whitakers' grandson during visits, a small detail Carol noticed, but didn't fully understand until months into the placement. He simply didn't believe it was worth the effort if he might be moved again. One evening, about 2 months before the taping, Jaden had asked Carol, out of nowhere, while she tucked him in, "Do you ever get tired of me?" Carol had to step into the hallway to compose herself before answering. But nobody in that house that night knew that same guardedness would surface again, in a completely different form, in front of a national television audience. The specific reason the Whitakers applied for Family Feud was almost incidental. A fellow foster parent in their support group had done the show 2 years earlier and mentioned how much the prize money had helped cover an adoption finalization fee for another family in similar circumstances. Carol filled out the application mentioning, briefly, that they were a foster family hoping to eventually adopt if reunification efforts with Jaden's mother continued to stall. She didn't expect a callback. It came within 10 days, and Jaden, when told, asked only one question. "Do we have to stay if I don't want to?" Carol promised him they could leave any time he wanted, and that seemed to settle something in him enough to agree to go. The taping moved through its early rounds with typical energy. The Delgado family boisterous and confident. The Whitakers quieter but clearly warm with the crowd. During a break while the board reset, Steve, doing his usual bit of engaging the youngest contestant with a light-hearted question, crouched down next to Jaden and asked, mostly as a throwaway line meant to get an easy laugh, so, "Young man, tell me, what's the best thing about living with Miss Carol and Mr. Dennis?" It was the kind of question designed for a cute, simple answer, something about video games, or a pet, or a favorite meal. Nobody in that studio expected what came next. Jaden looked down at his hands for a moment, then up at Steve, and said the three words that stopped the room cold. "Nobody stays long." Steve, still crouched, blinked, clearly expecting to move on to the next beat of the show, and then understood, in the half-second after the words landed, that Jaden hadn't answered the question he'd been asked. He'd answered a different question entirely, the one underneath it, the one about whether this, too, was temporary. The studio fell completely silent. Steve's smile disappeared entirely. He stayed crouched, not moving, staring at Jaden for several long seconds while the silence in the room grew heavier, the kind of quiet that even a live studio audience, trained by years of TV watching to fill dead air with applause, didn't dare interrupt. Carol, standing at the family podium, brought a hand to her chest, her breath catching audibly enough that the boom mic picked it up. Dennis reached for her other hand without looking away from Jaden. Steve placed his hand gently on Jaden's shoulder. "Say that again for me, buddy," he said quietly, though his voice cracked slightly on the word buddy. Jaden repeated it, this time a little quieter, almost apologetic, as if he sensed he'd said something he wasn't supposed to. "Nobody stays long. That's just how it goes." Steve took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, then had to look away from the boy for a moment, out toward the audience, blinking hard. When he turned back, his eyes were openly wet. But Steve wasn't done. He stood up, walked over to his stage manager, and said the line that would end up in every recap of the episode. "Stop everything. This has never happened in 45 years of doing this show, and I am not moving forward until I say what needs to be said." A producer near the wings signaled for a break, and Steve waved him off entirely. "No network approval on this one," he said. "This is me, Steve Harvey, and we're stopping." He knelt down in front of Jaden, at his eye level this time instead of standing over him. "Let me tell you something," Steve said, his voice thick. "I know what it is to feel like you're never staying anywhere long enough to matter. My family didn't have much when I was young, and there were stretches of my life where I didn't know where I'd be sleeping the next week, let alone the next year. I slept in my car for 3 years, showered in gas station bathrooms, and told everybody I ran into that I was doing just fine, because admitting how unstable everything felt was harder than just pretending it wasn't." He looked directly at Jaden. "So when you tell me nobody stays long, I hear you. I really do. But I want you to look at Miss Carol right now, and I want you to really look at her." Jaden turned, and Carol was crying openly, no longer holding anything back. "That woman," Steve said, "has been getting up in the middle of the night for over a year for you. That's not somebody who's about to leave, son. That's somebody who already stayed." He wasn't finished. Steve pulled out his phone, right there on the stage, something no host does mid-taping. He called the director of a regional foster care support foundation he'd worked with before. "I need a full therapeutic support package and a supplemental housing fund set up for the Whitaker family, fostering a 9-year-old named Jaden," he said into the phone, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "And I want an expedited case review requested on the adoption front. Today, not next quarter. He hung up before waiting for a response, certain of what the answer would be. Steve turned to face the cameras directly. "I want to talk to everyone watching at home," he said. "There's a 9-year-old boy who has learned from hard experience that people leave, and I need every foster parent, every adoptive parent, everyone who has ever shown up for a kid who wasn't born to them, to hear this. You are doing something that matters more than almost anything else a person can do." Carol was sobbing now, and dozens of audience members were too. And then, he did something no one expected. Even his own producers. He announced that both families, the Whitakers and the Delgados, would split the full fast money prize regardless of the outcome. The Delgado family's grandmother, watching from the other podium, crossed the stage without hesitation and knelt in front of Jaden, telling him in Spanish and then in English that in her 91 years she had learned that the people who stay are rarely the loudest ones, just the steadiest ones, and that he clearly already had one of those in his life. 3 months after the taping, the expedited case review moved Jaden's adoption process forward significantly, with a court date now scheduled that his mother's continued absence from required treatment milestones made increasingly likely to result in the Whitakers becoming his permanent, legal family. Carol said the hardest part of that waiting period wasn't the uncertainty itself, but explaining it honestly to Jaden without either overpromising or crushing the small, cautious hope he'd started allowing himself since the taping. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, it crossed 195 million views across platforms within 2 weeks, and the hashtag #NobodyStaysLong trended for 5 consecutive days, prompting a wave of foster care advocacy organizations to use the clip in recruitment campaigns for prospective foster parents, several of which reported measurable increases in inquiries in the months that followed. A year after the taping, Jaden's adoption was finalized, and Carol's arrhythmia, monitored closely by her cardiologist, had stabilized once the added financial and support stress eased. Her doctor noting at a follow-up appointment that her numbers looked better than they had in over 2 years. Today, the Stay Long Foundation, named directly from Jaden's own words at his insistence, has provided respite care funding and therapeutic support to over 720 foster families nationwide, and to date has distributed $9.5 million to keep placements stable rather than letting kids cycle through the system, with a particular focus on covering the exact kind of therapeutic and supplemental costs that fell through the cracks of the Whitakers' own applications. Jaden still keeps the oversized jacket he wore that day, now fitting him properly, folded on a shelf in what is officially, permanently, his own bedroom. In a later interview, Steve said those 3 words were the shortest sentence that had ever stopped him cold in 45 years on television. "He wasn't trying to break my heart," Steve said. "He was just telling me the truth as he understood it. And sometimes the truth a child hands you, without even meaning to, is the loudest thing you'll ever hear." Carol still sends Steve a photo every year on Jaden's adoption anniversary, and he has replied to every single one personally. What Jaden's 3 words revealed to 200 stunned people in that studio, and to millions more afterward, wasn't really about the foster system alone. It was a reminder that children who have been let down carry that expectation quietly into every new room they enter, and that the truest gift we can offer them isn't a promise of forever, it's simply proving, day after unremarkable day, that we're still there. Carol said it plainly in a later conversation. Love, to a child like Jaden, was never going to be believed in words. It could only be believed in time, accumulated one ordinary unremarkable day at a time, until eventually the evidence outweighed the fear. If this story about a 9-year-old's 3 words moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to know that showing up consistently is its own kind of love. Have you ever watched a child learn to trust again after being let down? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more moments that restore your faith in humanity.